Honorable members of the tribunal, dear colleagues, good evening everyone. I am Abdullah Munjid and I am here on behalf of my client, Drone IPLC. I will present the claimant from the substance side, alongside with my co-counsel Zainab Amr will present the claimant from the procedural side. Members of tribunal, before I discuss my submissions, I would like to paint a big picture about the case at hand. At first, the parties concluded a contract for the sale of 6 drones from the claimant's top model, which was Kestrel I 2010 model. When the dispute arose, members of the tribunal and when the respondent intended to avoid the parties' contract, the respondent, relying on its domestic law, alleged that the CISG could not apply since here, from the respondent's perspective, have a sale of aircraft. In contrary to these allegations, members of the tribunal, and in order to answer your concerns regarding this pleading, I would like to discuss two submissions here. The first one, that the CISG could apply on the case at hand, and the second one, that in case that the CISG apply, the respondent could not rely on its domestic law to avoid the parties' contract. Members of tribunal, I will start with my first submission that the CISG could apply on the case at hand. Like what I stated above, that the reason of this question is the respondent's perspective that the drones are type from aircraft, and those the CISG could not apply since the CISG expressly excluded aircraft from its scope of application. In contrary to these allegations and claimed from the respondent, the CISG could apply, members of the tribunal, and I want to discuss two main points here. The first one, that the drones, and specifically the drones in our case, does not meet the reasons why the CISG excluded aircraft from its scope of application. And the second point, members of the tribunal, is that the features of our drones prove that it's not an aircraft. I will start with my first point, members of the tribunal, and relying on the history of the CISG and specifically Article 2, Paragraph E. There are two reasons why the CISG excluded aircraft from its scope of application. The first reason is the registration issue, and the second one is the different position of the movable or non-movable of the drones, of the aircraft, members of tribunal. Regarding the registration, members of the tribunal, the drones in our case does not registered, and there was no any requirement to register it, and those should not be considered under Article 2 of the CISG. If I may direct the tribunal to record 36 from the case, members of the tribunal, which is Respondent Exhibit 5, the Aviation Safety Act of the Equatorial and the respondent's country, and if the tribunal see Article 10, the registration, and I will read to the tribunal, any aircraft owned or operated by a private entity in the territory of Equatorial shall be registered at the aircraft registry. Here it's clear, members of the tribunal, that only the aircrafts which is owned by a private company or a private party, members of the tribunal, should be registered, while all the aircraft or drones or whatever the respondents see it should not be registered while it's owned by an entity of the government. And we know that in our case, the respondents is a private company owned by a state, and those the drones should not be registered, members of the tribunal. Moving to the second point, members of the tribunal, that the drones in our case should be considered as a movable goods. And like we know that the CISG only deal with the sale of movable goods, those the CISG could apply since the drones in our case should be considered as a movable goods. Members of tribunal, if you could move with me, please, to record 10 from the case, which is the Claimant Exhibit 2, the purchase and supply agreement of the parties, which signed on 1st December, and if the tribunal see Paragraph 2, the second line, the last three words, and I will read to the tribunal that a strategy to explore and exploit the nature resources located in the northern provinces. Here, members of the tribunal, the purpose of the respondents from buying the claimant's drone is only for the surveillance of the earth and the exploration of the north part from the respondent's country to find the resources and to find the minerals, members of the tribunal, and that located of the northern part of Equatoriana. Here, members of the tribunal, the respondent not buy the drones to travel from one place to another. It's only for the surveillance under the border of the Equatoriana country, and the drones here should not have a nationality. It's only for a local use, members of the tribunal, and then since it's only for a local use and not have a nationality, it should not be considered as a territory of Equatoriana, members of the tribunal. Then it should be considered as a movable goods and the CISG could deal with it. If the tribunal don't have further question regarding this point, I would like to move to my second point, that the features of our drones prove that it is not aircraft. Members of the tribunal, the main difference between aircraft and the drones is the purpose of it. While the purpose of the aircraft is for carrying human or cargo, but instead the purpose of the drones is only for surveillance and to take video or pictures of the earth or whatever. Here, members of the tribunal, the drones in our case, like what I stated above, that it's only for surveillance. And maybe the tribunal asked that it's could have a 245 kilogram payload. But if the tribunal move with me to record 45 from the case, procedural order number 2, question 9, the last line stated that neither of the UAVs has the ability to carry human. Here, members of the tribunal, it's clear that even if the drones could have a payload about 245 kilograms, but it is still not have the ability to carry human or to carry cargo, and thus from the features of the drones, members of the tribunal, should be considered as a drones, not an aircraft. If the tribunal not have any further question regarding this submission, I would like to move to my second submission, please. Okay, thank you, members of tribunal. And moving to my second submission, that in case that the tribunal see that the CISG could apply, the respondent could not rely on its domestic law to avoid the party's contract. Members of the tribunal, like what I stated, that the reason why the respondent unjustified terminated the party's contract is the allegation of the respondents that there is a misrepresentation constituted by the claimants by not inform the respondent that there is a new model of the drones products of the claimants. But members of the tribunal, in our case, the respondents could not avoided the contracts, and I would like to discuss two main points here as well. The first one, that the alleged dispute by the respondent should not be considered as a misrepresentation, and instead should be considered as a conformity, members of the tribunal. And the second point, members of the tribunal, that even if it is a misrepresentation, the CISG still could deal with it. Regarding my first point, members of the tribunal, that the alleged dispute alleged by the respondent should not be considered as a misrepresentation, but instead should be considered as a conformity issue. Members of the tribunal, the definition of the misrepresentation is a mistake information or a mistake statement from a party to another party of the related information in the party's contract, while the definition of the conformity, we could find it in the CISG itself. If the tribunal see Article 35 from the CISG regarding the conformity, stated that in paragraph 1, the seller must deliver goods which are the quantity, quality, and description required by the contract, and which are contained or packaged in the manner required by the contract. Here, members of the tribunal, the conformity means that the seller should deliver goods with the same provision stated by the parties' contract. The alleged dispute in the current case, members of the tribunal, turned around the description of the parties of the goods or of the drones. The respondent alleged that in the parties' contract or in the tender, the respondents ordered a state-of-the-art drone from the claimants, while the respondents alleged that the drones which delivered or which sold by the claimants is not the state-of-the-art of the claimant's products. Here, members of the tribunal, the dispute turns around the state-of-the-art provision, which should be considered as a description. The state of the arts mean the top model or whatever. Thus, it should be considered as a description, members of tribunal, and like what I stated in Article 35 from the CISG, that the description is part from the provisions of the conformity of the goods, members of tribunal, and then the alleged dispute by the respondent should be considered as a conformity issue, not as a misrepresentation issue. And like what I state, since the Article 35 from the CISG deal with the conformity matters, then this issue should be settled by the CISG members of the tribunal. I'd not like what the respondent act by avoided the contracts relying on its domestic law. If the tribunal don't have any question regarding this point, I would like to conclude my submission, please. Okay, thank you, members of tribunal. And in conclusion, and from all the reasons that I stated above, we could reach a result that first, the CISG could apply on the case at hand, and the second, that in case the CISG apply, the respondent could not rely on its domestic law to avoid the parties' contract. Thank you very much, members of tribunal.